By the way, this particular stream might be a little a little less coherent than normal because one, it's like it's something that's a little personal to me, but also it's a 60 slide presentation, so I'll be experiencing these with you guys since I'm a little low on sleep as well. Are you about to talk about how unis slash college in general, or just in the West and stuff? So my focus is going to be from the stuff that I've spoken to other people about, the stuff that I have receipts for. So it's going to revolve a lot around Australia, and as a result of that, in the West. But the other things that I talk about, like the main features that I'm going to be talking about when it comes to like how universities operate, the effects of their business model on the students that sign up, that's going to be pretty universal, I would assume. All right. So, okay. Before I begin this stream, a few disclaimers. First of all, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about in terms of the evidence, for the problems that I'm about to discuss and stuff like that, a lot of it is going to be anecdotal and alleged. Reason being that a lot of the people who've approached me to tell me their experiences are very reasonably quite concerned about retaliation. On top of that, I also want to really emphasize this is not journalism. This is not going to be journalism. I don't have a lot of respect for journalism, but I still feel like it's important to declare that I don't intend for this to be interpreted as journalism. And also because a lot of the information that I'm about to show you guys, I have already sent off to multiple news stations, none of which ever got back to me. Again, I don't think it qualifies as news, not quite. And, well, I mean, you know what they say. If other people don't share your concerns, just express them yourself. And that's what I'm going to be trying to do. So, on this channel, we are no strangers to exploitative corporations, exploitative industries, exploitative institutions. And we're going to be talking about an industry that sells itself mainly off of prestige, the prospect of a stable future, and a bright career to people who have nowhere to go. And that institution is higher education. If you're in America, you call it college. In Australia, we call it university. So I'm going to be referring to it as uni. Now, I want to start this off by just telling you a little bit of a personal story about how I got into university. So, in Australia, like with a lot of other countries, at the end of high school, you take a standardized exam, or a series of standardized exams. You get to pick the subjects, but at the end of the day, what happens is, the scores that you get from your various exams all get funneled into what's called the University Admissions Center, which is basically an organization that has a bunch of wizards that crunch the numbers and turn all of those exam results into a single number, a rank that is supposed to, place you among the other high school graduates in your state that determines how, susceptible you are to higher education. The higher your number, the more courses become available to you. The more courses you can enroll by simply just signing up. I happen to get a pretty high number, and as a result of this high number, I was invited to participate in my university's scholar program. And just to make sure you didn't mishear that, scholars program, not scholarship program. I wasn't getting any money for being a part of this. Basically, what this was a group of high school high achievers that they put together, and we were going to be given a title of being like a scholar of some sort, and also we were supposed to have certain subjects, certain units available to us that supposedly nobody else had access to, right? So, I want you to keep this in the back of your mind, right? On the day, so they scheduled our induction into this scholars program in early January of our first year, and we don't start uni until like February for most people. So when we were invited to attend this induction, this was basically supposed to just be like a casual, almost kind of meet and greet, where you would get to interact with other people who are also in this program. And as a result of that, like, you know, they were going to offer like free champagne throughout, because it was assumed that everyone was at this point like above 18 years old. Free champagne and like finger foods, so like biscuits and maybe a sandwich, right? This was, for many of us, our first time setting foot on campus properly, like as a student that was going to be there to study, right? So this was our first taste of university life. And this was also our first opportunity to meet these other people who were supposedly just as interested in academia, just as driven as we were. So understandably, a lot of people would have been really excited, a little overexcited to attend this event. Now, over the course of my university degree, I have done quite a few things. Some things I tolerate in hindsight. Some things I'm not quite proud of. But one thing that I will always be proud of is the fact that when I went to this induction event, I just went in a pair of chinos and like a normal button-up shirt. Unlike some other poor fucks that went dressed in like a full-on suit. So, and the reason why that was such a bad decision is because, for some fucking reason, they'd chosen to schedule this in the middle of Australian summer. And it doesn't matter if you're from Australia or not, you know what Australian summer is like, right? So I want you to picture this in your head. A bunch of, like, you know, young, hot-blooded, like 18, 19-year-olds all gathered together, drinking, getting a little tipsy. Some of them are woefully overdressed for the climate. And they tell us that, you know, at some point they tell us, okay, now I want you guys to file into the auditorium so we can conduct the induction ceremony, right? And as we were walking into this auditorium, imagine our surprise when we looked around the room and we came to the grim realization that, except for the stage at the front where all the speakers were seated, there was not a single chair in that fucking room. And imagine our dawning horror as we looked up and realized that there wasn't any proper air conditioning either. So, and again, because a lot of people were tipsy, a lot of people were excited, there wasn't like a big fuss about this. We just kind of filed in and resigned ourselves, right? So you had over 100 of over 100 of us crammed into this auditorium without air conditioning in the afternoon of an Australian summer day, standing shoulder to shoulder. And at the front, then you get, like, you know, your shriveled professors, your jaded alumni, your deadpan academia staff, like the dean or the vice chancellor or something. And they were, you know, they were moving up to the front, moving up to the podium so they could, you know, give us a lecture about, oh, what an opportunity we've had granted upon us. How proud we should feel that we were there. How rare it is for someone to make it into this scholars program. And about halfway through the entire thing, when the third or fourth speaker had gone up to the podium, and after they had said a few words, from the back of the room, we hear this. Some poor girl had just fainted from the heat and collapsed on the spot. Now, obviously, there were people who, like, you know, escorted her out of the building to, like, check up on her and make sure she was okay. And the speeches ended pretty soon after that. And I tell you this story not because I want to flex that I made it into some program or whatever, but to really hammer home one really important idea that I want you to keep in the back of your mind throughout the entirety of this stream. And that is that academia, regardless of how much it tries to gas you up, regardless of how prestigious it makes itself out to be or how prestigious it tries to make you feel for being a part of it. Academia doesn't give a shit about you. It doesn't matter if you're a student, a tutor, or even a professor. They just don't care. Academia is, at its core, as it exists right now, an industry. It's designed to churn out graduates and degrees. If you succeed, they'll pat you on the ass, invite you back so that you can inspire more people to enroll. If you don't, then they'll just wash their hands of you. I said this in my last stream, but academia is like Ouroboros, except instead of a snake eating its own tail, it's a man filleting himself. Because it is among the most self-congratulatory of institutions I have ever personally experienced. So, academia doesn't care about a lot. It doesn't really care about its staff, doesn't really care about its students. But there is one thing that academia does tend to care about, and that is media attention. Now, this is going to be like I'm going to go on a tiny tangent about just the way that media coverage works in general. So, in Australia, news coverage about universities tends to pool into, it tends to fall into trends, right? There'll be certain subjects that get talked about a lot over a small period of time. Those subjects will gradually fall out of the public eye or out of, relevance, and then they'll be replaced by another one. So currently, what's going on right now is the issue of student protests and how universities facilitate/allow student protests. Around this time last year, the same thing was happening, but for the issue of sexual misconduct on campus and in student colleges. And I bring this up not to say that either of these issues aren't worth talking about. I really do believe that both of these issues are very important to talk about. But here's where we get into a little bit of an issue in terms of how the news covers topics. So, you would have noticed that news tends to happen in cycles, right? A lot of you will be familiar with the term news agenda. And in my first video, I talked about the two tools that news organizations use to create this agenda. The first one being framing, which is basically when they take some issues or some parts of a situation and emphasize that at the cost of either neglecting or, at worst, obscuring other aspects of what's going on or other issues that are going on. And the second one being agenda setting, which is an organized use of framing to set society's agenda in terms of what problems are most important to address first. Now, again, a lot of you will be familiar with this idea. This is nothing new to you guys. If you watch the news, you know that news has an agenda. Hopefully these words have given you more terminology to describe it, but the fact remains the same. What you might not be aware of, though, is that this agenda is actually determined based on a set of principles, news values that get taught to us, taught to all journalists when they're doing their media degrees. And these news values are as follows. You have impact, timeliness, prominence, proximity, unusualness, conflict and controversy, human interest, and cultural currency. Now, I'll be explaining what some of these are a little bit more in a second, but this is a pretty large list, reasonably large at least. This is like 8 total different values, right? And usually when it comes to determining whether a story satisfies the condition of possessing news values, a story will possess multiple of them. However, and again, this is something that all of you get, that everyone who does a media degree gets taught. But if you don't have a media degree, and if you're just watching the news, you could be forgiven for thinking that the list of news values actually looks a bit more like this. So this is part of a larger trend that's been happening in journalism since, I would say, the advent of the internet. Already, these issues tended to get a little bit more representation when it comes to the kinds of articles that would be written, because these kinds of news values and the stories that they create tend to get the most attention if all you read is the headline. However, when the internet became a thing, these skyrocketed in terms of viability compared to the others. And It's part of the reason why we have this problem with, like, headline reading being such a common method of comprehension and interpretation in the way that we just operate on social media. And especially because news nowadays is published in a way that integrates social media and has to play by the rules of social media platforms. These are the news values that have kind of overshadowed all of the rest. So, cultural currency sounds very sussy. Oh, believe you me, we are going to get to that one in a second. So, in terms of what each of these news values are, I'll give you an example. So, timeliness, pretty self-explanatory. It's basically just how recent something has happened. However, the problem is, in the pursuit of timeliness, every news organization has done this at least once. But when you're pursuing timeliness, you open yourself up to the risk of making mistakes when you're trying to get to a story first. Now, this was a news story that was published originally by 7 News in Australia. So a few weeks ago in Bondi, we had a mass stabbing occur. And 7 News, in its rush to satisfy this news value, in a rush to get the story out first, got the wrong guy. They named a guy called Benjamin Cohen as the perpetrator of the stabbings. So, as a result, thankfully, he's been given a defamation settlement with 7 for an undisclosed amount of money. But again, every news organization has committed this kind of misinformation or defamation at least once. And more often than not, I would say, it's because they're trying to pursue timeliness. Is that the reason why drama channels are criticized? Yeah, that could also be part of it. Because again, when you're a drama channel, you need to get to things quickly. And the problem with journalism is that the overwhelming bulk of journalism has basically morphed into being the exact same thing as, like, drama channels. The next value is prominence. Now, prominence basically means that your story revolves around or involves a prominent figure and or event. And this is funny because Moist Critical actually, like, talked about this in a video not too long ago, where he was mocking the fact that Dexterto seems to pay its journalist using his face. But in case you're wondering why you'll get these random news articles that headline or, use the picture of a prominent, like, celebrity or internet figure when the topic at hand doesn't really need to have anything to do with them, this is why they do it, because this is a news value in and of itself, right? Think of it as, like, sort of, it's the equivalent of the way that some content creators will clout chase by, like, trying their best to make all of their content revolve around a larger creator, but, like, the traditional news media organization version of that. In case you're wondering why you have so many Dexerto articles about Moist Critical, so many Sportskeeda articles about Asmongold, or so many news articles in general about Taylor Swift, this is why. The next value, conflict and controversy. Now, this has been like a selling point of news for eternity. As long as news has existed, even predating things like newspapers, news channels, this has been, again, one of the most prominent news values in the reporting of news. However, two things that modern iterations of news reporting have kind of done with this particular news value. One is that in their pursuit of conflict and controversy as a news value, a lot of news organizations, their news agendas tend to default to reporting on conflicts that have a very clear binary. Whether it's a moral binary or whether it's simply just two clear forces in opposition to one another, these tend to be the stories that get talked about the most. And these tend to be the way that things are being framed. So, for example, a lot of the university articles that I showed earlier on were very clear-cut examples of one side versus the other side. In this case, when you're talking about, like, student protests, it's a very clear example of student versus university, student versus institution. When it came to the sexual misconduct thing, it was the same sort of thing, right? Student versus institution, with a little sprinkling in of men versus women. Again, because of the fact that moral binaries tend to be favored more often as a result of this. Because again, you don't just want conflict and controversy. You want conflict and controversy that can be digested, condensed down to a single headline and understood by most people at a single glance, right? As a result of that, inadvertently, it has sort of made complexity and any sort of depth to that argument impossible. On top of that, it's also meant that any conflicts that occur, if there's an issue that occurs that's like complex, that's not just a clear case of us versus them or one side versus another. If it's like a systemic problem, it tends to get a good deal less coverage because it's simply just too much to get across. The other thing is that because this is such a prominent news value nowadays, we've fallen into the trap of journalists kind of trying to create controversies and conflicts out of nothing. And we saw this with the Assassin's Creed thing, where and I've covered this before, but essentially, there is a way that you can talk about an issue that makes the issue worse. And journalists ultimately get a choice in what kind of opinions they platform using their news articles. A lot of the time, the opinions that journalists will present as being like in the wrong or being the instigator of a conflict or controversy are relatively obscure. And the problem is, though, because they want to show off a conflict or controversy happening, they end up spotlighting those opinions over more neutral takes. So all of this kind of boils down to like a fundamental like ethical problem where a lot of journalism ethics, right, can be boiled down to a single principle. And that is, as a journalist, you do not get to make the things that you are reporting on happen, right? Obvious conflict of interest there. So what that means is, if you want to report on a controversy, you should not be the one creating that controversy. You should not be the one instigating that controversy. You should only be reporting on how it emerged. The problem is, this kind of journalism strays dangerously close to instigating that controversy entirely on its own. And this ties into the next news value, which is cultural currency. Now, cultural currency basically means that an article is somewhat relevant to, the existing cultural concerns at the time that it is being published. So, here's the problem. If you've ever wondered why news organizations tend to feed so much into like culture war stuff, like, your standard left versus right, black versus white, man versus woman, non-binary versus like everyone else. The reason why they do that is because it actually makes their life easier. Because if you exist in an environment where there is an ongoing culture war, all of your stories have cultural currency, or you can give all of your stories cultural currency really easily because you could just frame it through the lens of one of those existing conflicts. And we saw this with the gamer just coming in clutch with a brilliant example of why I hate journalism. But Resident Evil 5 is too racist for a remake. This is like the poster child of idiotic ways of reporting on an issue, or even just making an issue out of nothing. And again, the reason why they pursue this is because this feeds into an existing, cultural conflict that is currently going on, which is the issue of, anti-black racism. If you read through the article, it spends a lot of time talking about how, and this is me, condensing it by quite a lot. It spends a lot of time talking about how the game is supposedly racist because all the zombies are black and you're shooting all of these zombies. Even though the game is set in Africa, it kind of makes sense that, the zombies are black. So another example that I want to briefly touch on is an example that Friendly Geordies recently brought up in a video, which was an article that was written in Crikey about how Australia is doing its best to build up its manufacturing industry, or our current government is trying its best to build up our manufacturing industry. And the way that this article was framed was that it framed it as this sort of like, jobs for the blokes, this sort of feeding into the narrative of men getting privileged over women when it comes to the government's attention in building up an industry. Now, this was actually a move by the government to address what is a pretty complex problem. So when you think of Australia, right? I want you to think of Australia as like the OnlyFans model of first world countries. And what I mean by that is that our economy, a good chunk of our economic well-being, is completely reliant on having an audience that finds us interesting. So a lot of our economy is, floated up on the backs of trading our resources with, like, let's say, China, or our land to America, Alice Springs. So yeah, again, as a result of that, Australia doesn't really have, at the moment, a really strong manufacturing industry of its own. Our wealth comes in large part from just exporting our shit. So obviously, at some point in the future, that might become a problem. It would be helpful if we could make our own shit. But again, like I said, this is a very complex problem that has nuance to it. Nuance that modern journalism seems to be allergic to. Hence this way of portraying said issue, right? And again, I really want to emphasize, if you find it weird that news articles are tying things that seem to be like have no relation to an existing culture war, and you're wondering why, this is why. So you're not crazy, it's actually happening, and there is a word for it. Australia has a Hawaii problem. Yeah, pretty much. All right, so journalism right now is kind of dead, right? Where, say, except for investigative journalism, all the other forms of journalism are slowly being like rotted from the inside out because of that kind of way of, portraying the news. And investigative journalism is like a dying trade anyways, because at some point, if you're a successful investigative journalist, you'll either be forced between choosing to get a number or become a statistic. But the reason why this is such a problem is because even though journalism is a very flawed way of getting, communicating things to the public, it's an essential part of raising public awareness about a certain issue. And when you have an environment where journalism is done in a way that is allergic to complexity, allergic to nuance, other issues that have a level of complexity, nuance, that don't have a clear two sides to a problem or conflict, they kind of fall by the wayside.